When we picture a kamikaze pilot, we probably imagine a fanatic screaming "Banzai" as his plane dives toward an enemy ship. But what if that picture is wrong? What if I told you that many of these young men were terrified and didn't want to die? Their final letters home reveal a hidden, heartbreaking story of fear, pressure, and a generation of sons sacrificed for an empire that was already defeated. Section 1. The Problem. A Lost War. By 1944, Japan was losing the war, badly. Its empire was collapsing, its factories were being bombed, and its navy was at the bottom of the sea. Worst of all, its air force was a shadow of its former self. Japan's best pilots were gone, lost in the brutal dogfights over Midway and the Solomon Islands. Their replacements, teenagers and university students, some with just enough training to get a plane in the air. Meanwhile, the Allies were an industrial giant, churning out planes, ships, and pilots on a scale Japan couldn't possibly match. Facing total defeat, Japan's leaders became desperate. They needed a game changer, a strategy so extreme it could shock the Allies into backing down. They needed a weapon made not of steel, but of spirit. Section 2. The Solution. The Divine Wind. Their terrifying solution was the Tokotai, the special attack units, which the world would come to know as the Kamikaze. The name itself, meaning divine wind, was a callback to the 13th century, when two massive typhoons destroyed Mongol fleets that were invading Japan. The military hoped to create a new divine wind, this one made of young men and airplanes. From a purely strategic perspective, the logic was as cold as it was brutal. A normal pilot might get a lucky hit and, if he survived, fly back. But if the pilot was the bomb, that could guarantee a devastating strike. The leadership sold this as the ultimate expression of Bushido, the warrior's code of loyalty, honor, and self-sacrifice. But that was just the official story. This solution to a military crisis created a tragic new one for Japan's own sons. Section 3. The Tragedy, the Impossible Choice. So, were these pilots all fanatics eager to die for their emperor? That's the biggest myth of all. The truth is much more complicated. While the first few units may have had genuine volunteers, the program quickly turned into a system of intense pressure. Imagine being a student, barely out of your teens. You're gathered in a hall and asked to volunteer. Only it's not really a question. In a culture built on honor and duty, saying no wasn't an option. It would bring shame to you and your entire family for generations. With your friends and commanders all watching, the fear of being called a coward was often worse than the fear of death itself. So, they volunteered, trapped between dying in a plane and living in disgrace. Their final, censored letters home don't sound like they were written by fanatics. They sound like they were written by heartbroken sons. One pilot wrote to his child, Motoko, whom he'd bathed and held, telling her to ask her mother about him when she grew up. These aren't the words of zealots. They are the words of young men who loved their families, had dreams, and felt trapped by a duty they couldn't refuse. Section 4. The Mission. The Final Moments. The missions were just as grim as you'd expect. Many pilots were so green they'd get lost over the ocean or crash from mechanical problems long before they ever saw an enemy ship. Their training was incredibly short, sometimes just a few weeks, covering only what they needed for that one-way flight. For those who made it to an Allied fleet, the final moments were a terrifying plunge through a storm of anti-aircraft fire. They weren't all screaming with patriotic fervor like in the propaganda films. Many drank sake before takeoff, a ritual to steady their hands and numb the terror of what came next. And their very last act? To key a long, continuous Morse code signal. A signal that would only go silent at the moment of impact, letting their commanders know the mission was over. The story of the Kamikaze isn't just about history. It's a sobering reminder of the human cost of war. If we've given you a new perspective today, consider subscribing and hitting the bell. so you don't miss our next story from the hidden side of history. Conclusion. The legacy nearly 4,000 kamikaze pilots were sent to their deaths. Their attacks did inflict terrible damage, sinking dozens of Allied ships and killing thousands of sailors, but they couldn't stop Japan's defeat. After the war, their legacy was a painful and complicated one. To the rest of the world, they were symbols of fanaticism. Back home, the pilots who survived the war often struggled with a heavy burden of guilt and an uncertain place in a nation that had sent them to die. So the surprising reason they became kamikaze pilots wasn't some fanatical death wish. It was a tragic mix of real patriotism, intense social pressure, and a system that gave them no other choice. They weren't monsters. They were sons, brothers, and students, sacrificed by a military command that was desperate and defeated. Their story isn't meant to glorify them, but to serve as a powerful lesson on the true cost of war.